Latin American Literature and Culture in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Iowa. And he's going to present the labor of images, science fiction in 21st century Latin America. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, we can, once I, yeah. Well, that's okay.
What do you need?
It's more what you guys need to see the images. I know them, so what,
That's good. This is good.
yeah, okay, and I guess we can adjust it. So what I'm going to present today is part of a future project, or rather at the intersection of two future projects. So I'm currently organizing a conference on global science fiction cinema at the University of Iowa with a colleague in Asian and Slavic languages and literatures and cinema and comparative literature. And we're also teaching a course under the same title, Global Science Fiction Cinema, together. And we hope to co-edit a volume of the conference proceedings. And at the same time, I plan to write a second book on representations of labor in contemporary cinema. So I really see what I'm going to read today as sort of the intersection of two different things that I'm working on. And it is a work in progress, and I really do welcome any critiques or questions that will help me think through it better. The Labor of Images, Science Fiction in 21st Century Latin America. Science fiction cinema is uniquely poised to imagine and explore experiences of work. As a genre, it has most insistently staged the encounter between human and machine, an encounter that simultaneously foregrounds the value and precariousness of human labor. In fact, the history of science fiction cinema vividly registers how our conceptions of labor have shifted throughout the long 20th century, from the tense alliance between capital and labor imagined in a film like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which will recur throughout this talk, to contemporary discussions of labor's apparent demise under post-Fordism in the context of a rapidly accelerating global capitalism. In the Latin American context, what is the role of cinema in imagining the future of labor? In order to explore this question, I will analyze here two contemporary dystopic science fiction films. First, Argentine filmmaker Esteban Sapir's La Antena from 2007, and secondly, the Latino filmmaker Alex Rivera's Spanish-language film Sleep Dealer, a U.S.-Mexico co-production from 2008, so they're more or less contemporaneous. Strikingly different in their aesthetics, both Sleep Dealer and La Antena reflect upon shifting and uneven modes of labor, from the heavy modernist moment to the flexible, light, or liquid model of the contemporary period. Despite their vast differences, the two films converge in their attempt to reimagine the factory, the locus for modernist science fiction, in the context of our postmodernist, post-Fordist moment. For Marx, capitalist exploitation renders alien the product of the worker's labor, estranging him. In literary scholar Darko Survin's influential argument, science fiction as a genre is characterized by cognitive estrangement, by the defamiliarization of empirical categories. The genre's cognitive estrangement, I suggest, also implicates the doubly estranged labor that emerges under global capitalism, where workers are increasingly geographically displaced not only from the products of their labor, but also from the home and protectionist state, a result both of the erosion of modernist contracts and the promises and perils of new technologies. At its most estranging, Latin American science fiction also imagines alternative communities within the global division of labor, alternatives that emerge from within sites of contemporary injustice and with an eye towards historical inequalities rather than futurities. During the modernist period, films such as Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which I mentioned, Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, and Chaplin's Modern Times, which were all made within a 10-year period, the late 20s to the mid-30s, were fascinated by machines, even when they ostensibly represent the alienation of labor. Metropolis, for example, opens with a montage of working machines. Here, valves and pistons, gears and pulleys operate at both the aesthetic and thematic levels. Three features, I suggest, provide a taxonomy of the embodiments of labor in modernist cinema. First, the presence of the machine in these films is also the cinema's own fascination with itself as a machine. And I've been very influenced by J.P. Tellet's book, A Distant Technology, Science Fiction Film in the Machine Age, which is a really interesting work to think about modernist science fiction cinema. Second, the relationship between man and machine is of an antagonistic complementarity, predicated on the former, man, dominating the latter, machine. As Donna Haraway showed in her groundbreaking Cyborg Manifesto, in the modernist imagination, the monstrous monumentality of the machine could be tamed by its ultimate dependence upon the labor of man. Thirdly, modernist cinema also proposes a potential, if problematic, alliance between labor and capital, often represented, as in Metropolis, through a vertical hierarchical mise-en-scène. So I'll just show a few images that will sort of evoke the later films that I'm going to be showing you stills from. This is Metropolis. This is Man with a Movie Camera. This is sort of a euphoric depiction of cinema and labor alliance. This is also Man with a Movie Camera. And this is, of course, Chaplin's Modern Times, which there's a really interesting recent work by Michael North called Machine Age Comedy that talks about the inauguration of a new kind of comedy in the modernist period through the relationship between labor and machine. And this is another still from Metropolis that shows you how the relationship between labor and capital tends to be verticalized, spatialized as a vertical hierarchy, which is something that's going to change in the period that I'm looking at in this talk. So in contrast to what Zygmunt Bauman has described as the heavy or solid modernity of the modernist period, contemporary cinema suggests the light, fluid character of the postmodern period. Capital-labor relations, Bauman argues, are currently marked by disjuncture, with the increasing mobility of capital dependent upon the increasing lack of mobility of labor. While the former is legally sanctioned as flexible and liquid, the same cannot be said for labor, except for the increasingly common predicament of flex time, both symptom and example of the laborer's increasingly unmoored relationship to the workplace. As nationalist protectionist models, including the Fordist model and its populist manifestos in Latin America, became eroded in the 70s and 80s, the location of both capital and labor has become more dispersed and uprooted. And since at least the 80s, science fiction cinema has imagined this increasingly dispersed network, often through metaphors of grids or networks, of a shape-shifting capitalism more difficult to pin down or embody than in the earlier period. As a result of these changes, the fascination of the machine age in contemporary science fiction cinema, and I would argue in cinema more broadly, can only be ironic or melancholic. In Esteban Sapir's La Antena, the eclipsed possibilities of the machine age, decadent and monumental, become revisionist materials both in terms of the plot and in the film's mise-en-scène. In Sapir's homage to Metropolis, his protagonists undergo a pilgrimage to the factory, now depicted as the ruins of the promise of industrial and technological progress, an image of the post-industrial space very dear to contemporary science fiction. La Antena interests me for the way in which it turns our gaze to the cinema of the early 20th century and its relationship to the laboring body, with the goal of recuperating the failed possibilities of this earlier era and of defamiliarizing the present. Set in a future world in black and white and almost entirely silent, and this was a few years before The Artist, which has generated so much buzz for being a, oh my gosh, a silent film in the 21st century. Sapir's film imagines the fate of artistic production and dissent in a world dominated by the culture industry, by television in particular. It opens in Ciudad X, in which all citizens have lost the power of speech. Deprived of their voices, they communicate through words that float from their mouths and acquire a material presence that recalls, in certain moments, the experimental poetics of various Latin American and global avant-gardes. The protagonist, named simply Padre, has been fired from his job along with his own father, Abuelo, by the enraged Señor TV, the dictator empresario who runs the city. Señor TV exercises his power like so many dictators through a mouthpiece, in this case, the seductive, faceless figure known simply as La Voz, the only inhabitant of Ciudad X capable of speech. Her singing, broadcast through television, bewitches the city's viewers and listeners. So here's La Voz. You can see she has no face. And there's multiple shots of the experience of spectatorship in the film and the multiplying of television screens, which is sort of a visual motif throughout the film. In the course of the film, the protagonist and his family develop a plan to save the city and its silence through recourse to the antena, an old television transmitter, now in ruins, hidden far above the city. And this is the antena that gives the film its title. According to Andrea Bell and Yolanda Gavilan, the editors of an anthology of Spanish-language science fiction, the increase of this genre during the 60s and 70s in Latin America can be attributed in part to authoritarian regimes in the region, a fact embodied in the disappearance of Héctor Oesterheld, author of El Eternauta, the 1957 sci-fi graphic novel to which Sapir's film pays homage in various moments. So here's some images from El Eternauta. It's a dystopic, probably the most famous Argentine sci-fi text, and one of the marks of its dystopia is that the city of Buenos Aires is blanketed in snow, which also occurs in the film La Antena. And also the use of the mask is something that occurs in La Antena as well. So it's sort of citing these icons of Oesterheld throughout the film. With its telescoping of different historical moments, Sapir's film asks us also to consider how the dictatorships of the Southern Cone paved the way for the neoliberalism of the 90s and early 21st century. This link between the market's reign and state terrorism is rendered hyperbolic in the figure of Señor TV. When the father and the grandfather are fired, for example, we see a close-up of their photo ID cards along with a serial number and a stamp with the word retirado, an image that refers simultaneously to different types of totalitarianism in which the protagonists are disappeared by being expelled from the world of the market. These images are pointedly, insistently unsubtle, invoking the striking images of both the agitprop of the historical avant-gardes and the popular graphic novel genre, including Oesterheld's. With them, the film declares its explicit allegiance to both Metropolis and Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment, one of the first texts to link mass media manipulation to totalitarian impulses. In this sense, and in spite of recent efforts to think the relationship between spectatorship and media in a less monolithic fashion, Sapir insists on the anachronism of this reading, not as a faithful portrait of the culture industry, but as a hyperbolic rendering of its central feature, which he believes to be repetition. Rendering the metaphoric literal, a strategy that both fantastic literature and cartoons have in common, the film thinks the uncanny connections between authoritarianism and the market. In the literalized metaphor of consumption, the increasingly inseparable relationship between publicity and private life, inaugurated by television and accelerated in the internet age, is represented in the film as an unceasing and self-regulating circuit of tautology, as we can see in the images here. So all of the inhabitants of the city eat this TV food, it's sort of like a literal TV dinner, which is marked by this image of the spiral, which is a motif that runs throughout the film, suggesting this circuit or tautology repetition of consumption. And in these two stills, two mothers, working mothers, bring home food to their children, and it's the same food, and it's that spiral-shaped cookie which people are seen to be eating as their only source of food. For the inhabitants of Ciudad X, consumption itself has become another form of labor. But it is through the shots of the antena itself where we find the film's elliptical relationship between cinema and labor, or between the film's diegesis and its meta-cinematic reflections on its own means of production as a film. Here, as in the modernist cinematic imaginary to which Sapir is self-consciously indebted, small bodies are juxtaposed with enormous machines, replete with impressive gears and levers. So this is an image from the antena. And just to kind of, again, show how it's citational, this is an image from Metropolis. This is an image that we've seen from modern times, so we can see the way in which the film is interested in hearkening back to the relationship between human body, labor, and machine. However, it is precisely in the citation of these precursors where we find the distance that makes Sapir's critique, along with the film's defamiliarizing aesthetic, possible. For L'Antenne distances itself, with a great degree of melancholy, I think, from the alliance among cinema, work, and the possibility for a new society implicit in these modernist films. Seen from the present, the fragile human body working in tandem with the industrial machine produces a certain nostalgia for a labor not entirely eclipsed by mechanization, constituting an example of what Daniel Rosenberg has labored future nostalgia, or nostalgia for certain lost possibilities of a futurity that would imagine a collective labor of worker and cinema. In the sequence where the protagonists travel to the antenna, these machines seem to us enormous, estranging, literally otherworldly. And in order to get to the antenna, it's located, again, this vertical sort of mise-en-scène above the city, and they travel, and then there's an homage to Méliès's trip to the moon, and then they arrive at this abandoned ruin of sort of industrial progress. So it gives it this sort of fantastic, almost time travel as well as space travel dimension. Indeed, the moment in which the father moves the lever to exploit the potential of this monument, so I'm referring to this moment, in ruins, is almost fantastic. Manual labor itself, the film suggests, has become reoratized in the present. When the protagonists finally arrive at this mythical machine, their bodies are minuscule in relationship to its monstrous, decadent monumentality. In this sense, Sapir's film searches for an alternative grammar to construct a retro-future sci-fi based on the as-if. What would happen if we imagine the past not as the origin of our present, but as something that might have been otherwise? In this sense, there's a kind of mise en abîme between the labor of the protagonists and that of the film itself. Father and grandfather repair broken television sets. That's their job. They are low-level technical workers and pointedly not manual laborers. They are, moreover, dedicated to the rehabilitation of older technologies, just as the film is itself. Toward the beginning of the film, a close-up shows the street sign where the protagonists live, Calle Eclipse. And it's actually emphasized in several shots by the camera, and I would suggest that this eclipse has a couple of different meanings. On the one hand, it signifies the superposition of one object over another in order to hide it, which recalls the film's own superimposition of different media technologies and epochs. For example, television with silent film, which obviously can never coexist in any kind of conventional chronology. In fact, the film adopts an extensive taxonomy of early cinematic formal strategies, and I'll show you some examples of those. But just first, I wanted to point out this is a shot from Sapir's first film, Picado Fino, which is sort of an homage to Eisenstein. If L'Antenne is an homage to Metropolis, this is sort of an homage to Eisenstein. And he again focuses on the word eclipse over and over again. I think he's very kind of fascinated by this word and what it might mean. But in terms of L'Antenne, the strategies that he uses are, for example, the obsolete iris shot, which is sort of a signature of silent film, the superimposition of surrealist images, and here I would also, in addition to the superimposition, call your attention to the fact that the hand is scarred, because I'll be mentioning the scar in a bit. Here we have a very sort of Buñuelian sort of eye, and also Vertovian sort of repetition of the eye. So these kinds of cinematic techniques, as well as references to Voyage to the Moon, Metropolis, Modern Times, Gilda, which is a film noir set in Argentina, so it's sort of, you know, in postmodern fashion piles on these different citational references. And so that's one way to understand Eclipse, right? But I think there's another way to understand it as referring to that which has been eclipsed, what has been left behind but still persists in residual fashion, as in the after image. The technological dreams and nightmares of early cinema and its relationship to labor reemerge as a way of defamiliarizing our contemporary audiovisual media. In order to make the film, Sapir employed optical effects and toys proper to early cinema and the so-called pre-cinema, including dioramas, superpositions, mirrors, and this sort of desire to make things the way films used to be made is a kind of nostalgic desire. However, and as Sapir himself has also acknowledged, this return was not entirely possible, so he had to make compromises with new technologies, including green screens and digital effects, which also form part of the film's production. Even as the film laments the more artisanal and material modes of cinematic production, it recognizes the impossibility of such a return. In this sense, it's also worth recalling that while Argentina had an important historical avant-garde in the realm of literature and painting, it did not have an important avant-garde, historical avant-garde film tradition during this period. That would come later in the third cinema movements of the 60s and 70s. So in this way, we could say that Sapir has made, in the 21st century, the first avant-garde silent film in Argentina, and perhaps also the last. So now I'm going to move into the second film that I'm going to be talking about. And if La Antena speaks of the future through the past, Alex Rivera's Sleep Dealer adopts an inverse process, speaking of the past through recourse to the future. This film was released 1 year after Sapir's, and it's Rivera's first feature-length film. He's a documentary filmmaker known primarily for short films that deal with issues of globalization, immigration, and the border, the U.S.-Mexico border in particular. And this film was co-written with David Riker, who made La Ciudad, which is a film some of you might have seen, and it received the Sloan Award at the Sundance for the Best Film on Technology in 2008. So if La Antena is a post-dictatorship film, Sleep Dealer is avowedly a post-NAFTA film, participating in the emergent genre of U.S.-Mexico border science fiction as an imaginative response to the increasingly globalized forms of labor that have emerged in the wake of NAFTA and the economic shifts it consecrated. In this sense, I would say that border sci-fi constitutes a direct response to the predominance of the city of Los Angeles in U.S. science fiction films of the 80s and 90s, shifting our gaze instead to sites like Tijuana, which is where Sleep Dealer is set. In this sense, Sleep Dealer provides a case study of border science fiction's staging of the mutually constitutive dimensions of first and third world labor. Has anyone seen this film? I'm just curious. Yeah. So just briefly, so the film tells the story of a journey and a transformation forged through the violence of global capitalism, and it alludes to both enduring and repurposed patterns of migration. Like a lot of recent films, the plot hinges on the fact that water has become the new oil, so heavily desired and policed, ferociously controlled in Mexico by multinational corporations, aided by state security forces based in the U.S. Its rising prices have devastated farming communities that depend on water for obvious reasons. So here's a few images to give a sense. This is at the beginning of the film, the protagonist and his father, who they're from Oaxaca. These are Aqua Terra, so obviously visually referring to the Zapatistas in certain ways, and they're people that try to take water away from the multinational corporations. Here's the Del Rio Water Corporation, which sort of surveys and polices the purchasing of water, which is heavily kind of monitored by these figures. So the protagonist's name is Memo, which definitely has a play with the idea of memory, which is important for the film, from a small town in Oaxaca. And because of this depletion of the water supply and a series of other devices, he's forced to migrate to Tijuana, where he goes to work in these infomaquiladoras, or sleep dealers, post-industrial factories premised on the exploitation of Mexican labor through computerized technology, made possible by interfaces called nodes. In this context, the material border between the U.S. and Mexico has been completely entrenched, rendering impossible any movement from south to north. And instead, traffic has become almost entirely virtual. So labor on the Mexican side, and the U.S. side, which is only very hazily depicted in the film through digital technology, benefits from this labor through the use of robots. So the workers are in Mexico controlling these robots that are on the other side of the border. On his way to Tijuana, Memo meets Luz, a young journalist who becomes interested in capturing his story, and then the film proceeds to chart his debilitation, his bodily debilitation in the sleep dealers, which are very dangerous, and his relationship with Luz. And the film ends with a call for new alliances among marginalized figures in this dystopic world, and its vision is kind of cyberpunk meets post-nationalist call for solidarity. That's the note that it ends on. So in Sleep Dealer, it's interesting, there's no nostalgia for industrial labor as the core of a leftist political imagination. Whereas I do think there's a bit of nostalgia in La Antena. Gone as well is the particular image of the factory as a unified, if problematic, site of labor's potential unity. Instead, the infomaquiladoras feature rows of workers working not in tandem as in the traditional assembly line, but laboring instead on individual projects in different parts of the U.S. So each of these workers is connected to the U.S. and doing an individual project. So instead of the Taylor's-Fordist model where one piece goes to on an assembly line, each one is involved in their own project. So the factory is less the organic body we find in machine-age films than atomistic individual cells connected to the north in a vast network, itself seemingly untotalizable. So there's no way to grasp these connections except for through these sort of atomistic bodies. In addition, the architectural machine of classic filmic representations of labor on the assembly line, which is what I said was sort of ironically cited in Sapir's film as an example of what one critic has called modernism's erotic technophilia, so it's love of machines, right, have been replaced by the gleaming bluish screens of the virtual factory, their chilly light inducing an ill pallor on the workers' faces. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of this. And the use of particularly blue and green would still call up computer screens or some sort of retro computer screens to us. If earlier films posited a relationship of technology to be mastered and a mutual dependency that simultaneously separated the identity of each, and a relationship that Sapir cites in order to underscore its eclipse, here we find the fusion of man and machine, or the cyborg. Plugged into the machines, workers appear to have no opportunity to master this grid, to separate themselves from it in the assertion of a discrete identity or agency. In Sleep Dealer, just as the scar of the sealed-off border recalls an earlier era of non-virtual traffic between the U.S. and Mexico, the persistence of the factory model and the film's continual shots of the minute and debilitating labor that sustains these infomaquiladoras reminds us that we are not entirely beyond Fordism, however, but somewhere else in the talk to contemporary discussions of labor's apparent demise under post-Fordism in the context of a rapidly accelerating global capitalism. In the Latin American context, what is the role of cinema in imagining the future of labor? In order to explore this question, I will analyze here two contemporary dystopic science fiction films. First, Argentine filmmaker Esteban Sapir's La Antena from 2007. And secondly, the Latino filmmaker Alex. You guys need to see the images. I know them. So
That's good. That's good.
yeah, okay, and I guess we can adjust it. So what I'm going to present today is part of a future project, or rather at the intersection of two future projects. So I'm currently organizing a conference on global science fiction cinema at the University of Iowa with a colleague in Asian and Slavic languages and literatures and cinema and comparative literature. And we're also teaching a course under the same title, Global Science Fiction Cinema, together.
Latin American Literature and Culture in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Iowa. And he's going to present the labor of images, science fiction in 21st century Latin America. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, we can, once I, yeah. Well, that's okay.
What do you need?
It's more what you, and we hope to co-edit a volume of the conference proceedings. And at the same time, I plan to write a second book on representations of labor in contemporary cinema. So I really see what I'm going to read today as sort of the intersection of two different things that I'm working on. And it is a work in progress, and I really do welcome any critiques or questions that will help me think through it better. The Labor of Images, Science Fiction in 21st Century Latin America. Science fiction cinema is uniquely poised to imagine and explore experiences of work. As a genre, it has most insistently staged the encounter between human and machine, an encounter that simultaneously foregrounds the value and precariousness of human labor. In fact, the history of science fiction cinema vividly registers how our conceptions of labor have shifted throughout the long 20th century, from the tense alliance between capital and labor imagined in a film like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which will recur throughout this